Well, tonight is the final night in a series of conversations that you've been having about this business of hospitality, and particularly hospitality in the face of terror. And you know something of that experience. You have ranged broadly so far. You have had some wonderful people come and challenge you in all sorts of ways about this business of hospitality. What I want to do tonight by way of conclusion is to bring it home. Is to remind you that your call to hospitality encompasses who you are and where you live. Who you are and where you live. So therefore, before we go any further, I want to invite you to close your eyes. And I can see if they're not closed. I want you to imagine yourself standing outside your front door. Are you there? Don't kick the plant. You're standing outside your front door. You take a few steps out onto the pathway, perhaps, and you look to your right. What do you see? I see some smiles. Turn the other way. Look to your left. What do you see? You can open your eyes now. It's what you saw in your imagination standing just outside your front door that I am most concerned about tonight. Where you live, the neighbourhood that you call home. That's where I want us to sit tonight as we talk together about this business of hospitality. You probably know one of the most familiar stories in Luke's Gospel that deals with neighbourliness. It's the story, of course, of the Good Samaritan. You could tell me that story off by heart. You might get the details slightly different from person to person, but you could tell me that story, no doubt, from beginning to end. You've heard it so many times. The story of the Good Samaritan. Why did Jesus tell that story? Because he was asked a question by a very learned man who said, "Jesus, who is my neighbour?" Of course, you know prior to that this same learned man came with an original question. How might I experience eternal life? How might I have eternal life? Jesus says to him, as a learned Jew, "You tell me." And this learned Jew gives the response that Jesus knows he will give, because he does what any learned Jew would do. He takes the bookends of the entire Torah, love God with heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself, as the summary of the entire Old Testament law code. In other words, do it all. But most importantly, love God and love your neighbour. Jesus says, "You've said it. You do that and you will live. You will have life in its fullness." So the learned man, a very devout Jew, responds by saying, "So who is this neighbour that I have to love?" Do you know that there are some 362 occurrences of the word neighbour in the Old Testament? I've counted them. 362 occurrences of the word neighbour in the Old Testament. 360 of them apply to fellow Jews. On 2 occasions, the word neighbour applies to the foreigner, the exile, the stranger. So this learned Jew is in part saying, who don't I have to worry about? Who can I neglect? Who can I walk away from? Tell me again, my primary responsibility in loving my neighbour is to love someone who is just like me, a fellow Jew. So when he says, who is my neighbour, it's a loaded question. And the way that Jesus answers that question, of course, is by telling this story. It throws all the categories up in the air and landing in all sorts of messy, chaotic places. He redefines neighbourliness. He redefines what it means to love one's neighbour as oneself. Not just the person who is just like me, not just the person whose skin colour and religion and ethnicity is like mine, but the neighbour is the one that you come across on your way, regardless of skin colour, ethnicity or religion. So on one hand, Jesus explodes the category. He applies it as broadly and inclusively and as widely as possible. But on the other hand, he never displaces the neighbour. That is, he does not make it so broad that it does not relate immediately to the person under your nose, the person you trip over on your way. Broadly defined, but very specifically placed. He tells the story of a road from one place to another, and everybody knows that road. Most of them travel it routinely. One of the most common routes of trade and commerce at the time. They know that road. It's in their neighbourhood. The neighbour is broadly defined, but located under your nose. So then, what does this mean? What does this mean for where we live? The internet tells me that's a picture of Christchurch. I don't know. Maybe it is. What does the business of loving one's neighbour as you love yourself mean for your locality, for where you live? It's a difficult question because the context in which Jesus told that riveting, challenging story of the Good Samaritan is so very different to our context. There are some really profound challenges for us to apply that story today because we do not live in the same world. The neighbourhoods that we inhabit are just so very, very different to the neighbourhoods of the New Testament. There are some challenges to neighbourhood in our context. And the first challenge of neighbourhood has to do with the way that we experience community with other people. At the time of Jesus, the vast majority of people lived in little village-like residential enclaves. Houses were built around a common water source and a common cooking fire. The homes did not have kitchens. They had sleeping quarters, and if the people were people of means, they may have had an open living space at the front of the home, but all of the neighbours in your little residential enclave would cook together, draw water together, farm together, worship together, be friends together. Their whole lives were centred around a common place. Their whole experience of community was centred around their little neighbourhood. The people that you worked with were the same people that you churched with, were the same people that you played Thursday night volleyball with. You did everything in common with the people who shared your neighbourhood. Is that the case for you today? It's not the case for me. My experience of community is almost entirely disconnected from where I live. I might go on a Wednesday night over to Camberwell, 45 minutes drive away, to go and see my dad, my ageing dad. I feel a deep sense of community with him. I get on the tram and I go about 20 minutes into the city where I work, and I experience community with the people that I work with. If I did play Thursday night volleyball, that would probably be off in some other God-forsaken part of Melbourne. My experience of community is all over the place. Rather than neighbourhood being the organising principle of my community, I am the organising principle of my community. My experience of community will be very different to your experience of community. But for many of us, when it comes to our daily experience of connection and community, very often the neighbourhood that we live in has very little to do with it. So when it comes to loving our neighbours, as far as the people that we come across on our way, it's a very different set of circumstances to the ones that Jesus faced and those in his audience faced. And then we think about the pursuit of privacy. That is so much a part of our Western suburban experience of residential life and of neighbourhood. Lewis Mumford, one of the earliest historians of suburbia, or historians of the city per se, said that suburbia is a collective attempt to live a private life. A collective attempt to live a private life. We all know what that's about, don't we? You know, I like my neighbours, I like to be in relationship with them, but the idea that they would be messing in my daily business is just a little more than I really want. One of our fundamental drives in our suburban way of life is to ensure that those fences remain, those boundaries remain. What happens inside the house is private. We like it that way. I like it that way. We like privacy. We like a sense of personal territory. We are wired for personal territory. We need it. We need the home to be a place of security and refuge for those within. We need to know that we can close the door and be together as a household, undistracted, uninterrupted by what's beyond us. For the people at the time of Jesus, it's just not the way that they did things. They lived life together in ways that we would find difficult and awkward and intrusive. So our experience of neighbourhood is so very different to the experience of those in Jesus' time. We have moved from the house in community to the house as private territory. Even the way that we build our suburbs today remind us of that. Remind us of what we really value. We may need community, but we don't feel it as deeply as the need for privacy, as the need for boundaries. And then, of course, there is the impact of mobility. We are incredibly mobile people. You think for a moment about your daily practices of mobility. The automobile has been called the second icon of suburbia. If the house is the first icon of suburbia, the car is what makes it possible. The average Australian household generates 12 auto trips every day. We spend most of our time exiting the neighbourhood. In fact, we spend more time exiting the neighbourhood than we do actually inhabiting it. 12 auto trips a day. Melburnians in the city that I come from travel some 10,000 kilometres every year within their city of residence. We are on the go. And if we can find time to go and knock on the neighbour's door, we're doing really well, because life is busy. We've got things to do. We've got places to be. And then think too about residential mobility. They tell me that the average Western citizen will have 30 residences in a lifetime. I wonder if I were to ask you on a blank sheet of paper to list all the places you lived up until this point in your life, how many would there be? Perhaps for some of you, there are far less than 30, and for others of you, 30 doesn't touch it, doesn't go near it. Yeah? We are on the move. We're not only on the move daily, we are on the move residentially. 2.5 million of us in Australia are moving house in any given year. 43% of Australian households are relocating every 5 years. Now, is that the same in New Zealand? I have no idea. But maybe some of the same sorts of challenges impact your experience of neighbourhood. Because if we're not there very long, then the motivation to kind of connect with, to bond with, to get to know and relate to the people next door is lessened, is weakened. But that's part of the reality that we deal with today. Fiona Alon, a wonderful Australian sociologist, has called us geographically promiscuous. Geographically promiscuous. We play fast and loose with the places of our lives. We move on. We move on. And perhaps the Indigenous people of both of our cultures remind us of something about place that is deeply sacred and important to what it means to be human. So in all these ways, the neighbourhoods that we live in today are just so very different to the neighbourhoods of Jesus' time. So before we can begin to say, what does it mean for us to love our neighbours, to act hospitably toward those under our noses every day, we need to acknowledge these factors. They're not going to go away. We might find ways to counter them, to moderate them, but this is something of the reality of our lives as residents in our particular contexts. But what we can do is remind ourselves that there are certain calls which are really important to our Christian discipleship. We are called to place. We are called to put our roots down in particular places for the sake of the gospel. We are called to be fully and completely present where we are. In light of that pursuit of privacy, which we all feel, we acknowledge that part of our discipleship is a call to connection, is a call to community making, building relationship with others. And then the one I find really challenging is that there is an element of our calling in discipleship which is a calling to stability. Stability. Staying where we are. Do you know there are two really fascinating images of discipleship in the New Testament, particularly in the stories of Jesus, but also in the epistles? There is the image of discipleship that we most commonly think about. One of the more common images of discipleship is the image of the soldier. The soldier. The soldier is the one who is packed and ready to go. Ready to move when God calls. No place to lay your head. Have your bags packed and you're ready to say, I will go wherever you call me to go, Lord Jesus. It's powerful. It's the image that has motivated many people to go as missionaries to the four corners of the earth. It's the image of discipleship which often motivates those of us in pastoral ministry to give up whatever we were doing before, to pack our ministerial bags and be ready to go wherever Jesus calls us to go, perhaps Christchurch or Canberra or Melbourne or who else knows where. We are called to go where Jesus calls us to go. The powerful image of discipleship. I remember those missionary conventions when I was a little boy, being on the edge of my seat, desperate that I would hear the call and wondering how on earth I could hear it. I remember laying in bed, my head on the pillow after one of those missionary conventions and thinking, maybe if I go to sleep, I'll miss it. Jesus might call while I'm sleeping. You know? Bags packed, ready to go. Powerful, biblical, it's important. But there is another image of discipleship, especially in the parables of Jesus, which is so very different to that one. And that is the image of the farmer. Now the farmer, God bless him, probably doesn't even have a suitcase. Or it's under the bed, covered with so much dust because he never uses it. He never goes anywhere. A farmer is the person who puts their roots down in one particular place and is there year after year after year, season after season after season, working with the same plot of ground, tilling the soil, sowing the seed, nurturing the seed, and reaping the harvest, and then doing it all over again, time and time and time again. The farmer stays put. I never heard the farmer talked about at those missionary conventions. But that is so many people at Oxford Terrace Baptist Church and at churches like mine. They're the stayers. They're the ones who just keep at it year after year. Everyone I met on Sunday, I'd say, how long have you been here? Somebody said 30-something years, 40-something. I think somebody even said 50-something years. These are the stayers. They just keep going. They keep at it. They keep showing up. Even when they put new doors in, they just keep coming. They're the stayers. And sometimes the stayers end up feeling a bit second rate when it comes to discipleship. You know, the ones who come and tell their stories of going off to the four corners of the earth, they're the disciples. They're the spiritual ones. We just keep coming to Oxford Terrace because that's what we do. As if we've settled for something perhaps a little second rung when it comes to spirituality. But Jesus told so many delightful stories about farmers, about the ones who just keep at it in the same place, putting down their roots. So there is something about this call to stability which is very much a part of our discipleship. It will look different for all of us, but it's there. It's really there, and it's really important. How many farmers do we have here? How many stayers? Would you put your hand up if you've been around this place for maybe 5 years or longer? Put your hand up. 10 years or longer? 20 years or longer? My goodness. 30? 40? 50? 60? Wow. We need to give her a standing ovation, I reckon. Isn't that extraordinary? The farmers. But there's something about our investments in neighbourhood which really depends on that farming mentality. Because every indicator in every study on neighbourhood health and well-being correlates that well-being with the stayers, with neighbourhood stability, with people who are prepared to say, this is where I live. I will be here for the long term. There is something about that that is spiritually magic, important, and we don't affirm it often enough. And so I want to say to all of you stayers, well done. Well done. It is an extraordinary thing that you have given to the kingdom of God. So all of that said, what I want to do tonight is to think about some of the spiritual disciplines of living in our neighbourhood that can help us embrace our neighbourhood as a place in which we give expression to the hospitality of God. If loving God with heart, soul, mind and strength and loving neighbour as ourselves is the essence of life in its fullness, then how can we go about practicing our faith in the neighbourhoods that we live in? Well, let me first talk about what I call the spiritual discipline of naming. Naming. One of the things that we have to do if we are to take our call to neighbourhood seriously is that we have to be able to say with confidence that the square kilometre in which I reside is as sacred as any other square kilometre on the face of the earth. The square kilometre that you live in is as sacred, is as God-inhabited as any other square kilometre on the face of the earth. Because it's true. It's true. Some years ago, I went to the Holy Land. I'd never been to the Holy Land before, to Israel, Palestine, incredible part of the world. I went with a television program called The Bishop, the Chef and the Fisherman. The concept was that the bishop, a bishop of North Sydney, pretty conservative bloke, New Testament historian, and a independent Baptist fisherman from Cairns, and me, a has-been washed-up chef, pastor from Melbourne, we went to Israel and we made 13 episodes of a program. The first segment in each episode was the bishop, the historian, in a particular place would tell us important things about that particular location. In the second segment, the bishop and the fisherman would go fishing in a nearby spot, maybe the Sea of Galilee or the River Jordan or the Sea of Tiberias or the Mediterranean Sea. Wherever we were, they would go fishing. And the idea was in the third segment, me, the has-been chef, would take whatever they caught and cook it and say inspiring things about the spirituality of food as I did so. The trouble is, in 13 episodes, they caught 2 fish. One was a tilapia, this big, in the Sea of Galilee, and the other was a catfish in the River Jordan without scales, according to biblical dietary laws, completely out of kosher, not to be eaten. So I was, to use the theological word, stuffed, completely stuffed. Here's me furiously driving to the fish markets of Tiberias to buy my little bag of sardines and tell the most atrocious lies on camera about where they came from, and in the meantime talking about God and spirituality. It was a terrible television program. And I have done my very best to ensure that all history of that television program has been erased from memory, so don't go looking for it. But the one benefit of being in the Holy Land for that television series was actually being in the places that Jesus inhabited. To walk through the villages or the remains of some of the villages where Jesus walked and told stories, to sit by the Sea of Galilee at the place where he told a particular parable. And it was really wonderful. It was beautiful and even at moments a bit profound. It was marvellous, but overwhelmingly it was just very ordinary. That's what struck me more than anything else, is the ordinariness of this place. Now, what was I expecting? Well, I'm embarrassed to say, but I really did imagine there might be streams of heavenly light and slightly illuminated white robes. And, I imagined that this place where the stories of the gospel were told and lived out would have been anything but ordinary, and yet for the most part, that's what it was. When I look at my neighbourhood back in Melbourne, I think it's pretty ordinary, really. And therefore, to claim my neighbourhood as somehow as sacred as any other square kilometre on the face of the earth feels a bit of a reach. But really it's not. God inhabits the neighbourhoods that we inhabit, and profoundly so. Profoundly so. And what we need to be able to do is to name that, is to acknowledge that where we live is of importance to God. It is important to God's kingdom. In order to do this, we have to practice what I call the spiritual practice of dawdling. We've got to be prepared to hang out in our neighbourhoods with no agenda, to walk our neighbourhoods. Because quite frankly, you don't see much when you're travelling at 40 k's an hour to get out of there in your car. You're more concerned about navigating your way around pedestrians and other things. But when you walk your neighbourhood, you see it. You see it, and you begin perhaps even to sense its beauty. You begin to sense that presence of God. In Australian Indigenous spirituality, there is a word in an Indigenous language, dadiri. Dadiri. It is an inner deep listening, a quiet, still awareness. It is that dadiri that we are called to take with us into the neighbourhoods that we inhabit. This is God territory. So how then do I go about listening for the voice of God? in the community I live in. Naming. The second discipline of neighbourhood is celebrating. Celebrating. Finding ways, once we've named this as God territory, once we have a clearer sense that God lives with us in this neighbourhood, what are the ways that we can go about celebrating what is good about where we live? What is good about where we live? There are a whole range of ways to do that. My dear brother Greg is more of an introvert than me, which I didn't think was possible, but he is. He's very introverted, he's very quiet. We inhabit a large and loud family, and he and I are the ones that sit quietly in the corner in family gatherings. Greg is not an extrovert. He likes people, but he'd rather not see them very often. He and I talked together about a little book I was writing a few years ago called God Next Door. And he was intrigued by the fact that I would write a book to begin with, and a little mystified by that. But he began to ask me some really good questions about why it is that I would give my time to such a practice. And I talked a bit about why I had given myself to write about neighbourhood and mission in the neighbourhood. As a consequence, Greg decided they were living in a cul-de-sac in Geelong, just outside of Melbourne, a little suburban cul-de-sac. There were 6 houses in their cul-de-sac. And he confessed to me that though they'd been living there at the time for about 12 years, he really didn't do anything other than nod at the man across the road. That was about the extent of their relationship. So he decided, based upon a conversation with me, that he would have a neighbourhood barbecue. And so Greg set about doing a little half A4 flyer. It's not very artistic, it wasn't very good. And he put it in all of the letterboxes, saying Saturday a week from now, 6 o'clock in the evening, it's daylight savings, that he would wheel the barbecue out to the centre of the cul-de-sac and you should come. I think that's what he wrote, you should come, on the bottom of the invitation. His wife Sally was a little unsure about this. She wasn't a great enthusiastic supporter, though she was the more outgoing of the pair. So Greg, the time came for the barbecue and he wheeled out his barbecue to the centre of the cul-de-sac, his folding chair, unfolded it and sat down. And he waited. And Sally is inside looking through the Venetian blinds, feeling terribly embarrassed for him. It took about 45 minutes of sitting with his arms crossed until the bloke across the road, the one he nodded at occasionally, came out with his folding chair and sat down next to Greg. Within about 15 minutes, every one of those 6 houses was represented in the circle around the barbecue. And Sally said about 20 minutes after that, she took her folding chair out, and then they stayed until about 11:30 at night. Nobody wanted to go home. And now they do it twice every year. Greg, who would imagine? You should come. There's something about the very simple practices of celebrating that are indeed so incredibly simple, a folding chair, that can lead us to a celebration of what is already good where we live. I am a marriage celebrant, as one or two others are in this room. What does a marriage celebrant do? A marriage celebrant speaks the reality of what already is. Here are 2 people. They are in love. It's not my doing. I didn't make the love. I don't create it through my magic words. It already exists. this profound and deep commitment between two people. What I do as a celebrant is I name it, I speak it, I articulate it. I make visible what is already true. What we need are neighbourhood celebrants, neighbourhood priests, if you like, people just like you who will be the initiators. Because it always takes somebody to initiate. I'll get my folding chair out of the garage. I'll be the one who takes the initiative. There are so many people in our neighbourhoods who are secretly longing that someone would take the initiative because they don't know how to do it. And neither do we, but we're the ones who are prepared to give it a shot, to give it a try, see how it goes. Because we are the ones who've been able to name this as God territory. We are the ones, therefore, who are able to celebrate what is good about this territory that we inhabit. We can also do this as churches. We at Collins Street work pretty hard at this in the neighbourhood that we inhabit in the city. And one of the things that I've encouraged members of our congregation to do is to write what I call neighbourhood liturgies. In fact, many of the older people who live in our congregation, I will go and visit them in their neighbourhoods in far-flung places. And it's got a bit of a reputation now because once I get there, I don't want to sit and drink cups of tea at their kitchen table. I want them to take me a walk around their neighbourhood where they live to tell me some stories, to tell me about the people who live either side. And older people in the congregation are the ones who know the people next door most commonly. And then what I ask them to do is to take what they've told me, some of the truths, some of the insights, and write it into a prayer or a psalm that we can use in the context of our Sunday worship. These are deeply local liturgies that can't be used elsewhere because they only relate to where that person lives. Or the liturgies that we write as a congregation about our neighbourhood at 174 Collins Street is a liturgy that you really can't read anywhere else because it doesn't make sense. It's local. But that's what makes it partly so beautiful. So having said that, I'm going to ask you to read one of our neighbourhood liturgies and just imagine yourself as members of Collins Street Baptist Church for a minute. Liturgies. We gather today in the presence of God, not a God far off and far away, distant and removed. No, this God, this Emmanuel, is the one who chooses to be near, right here, right now. Come now, Emmanuel, God of our neighbourhood, Lord of our lives. You are wonderful Anglicans. This is the God of Collins Street, the God of history, beauty, art and commerce. The God whose love for those in suits with black umbrellas knows no end. The God whose grace is the same yesterday, today and tomorrow. Come now, Emmanuel, God of our neighbourhood, Lord of our lives. This is the God of Swanston Street and of 6 o'clock traffic. The God who is as present in the rush hour as in the stillness. The one who sits on the Flinders Street steps with the lonely, offers love to the distracted, peace to the confused, and grace to the lost and the angry. Come now, Emmanuel, God of our neighbourhood, Lord of our lives. This is the God of Baptist Place, the God of laneways and hidden corners, the places where pain and struggle are hidden from view, where graffiti and artwork hint at stories untold, and where the refuse gathers as routinely as our failure. Come now, Emmanuel, God of our neighbourhood, Lord of our lives. This is the God of Russell Street, the God of office towers and corner pubs, the places where people work, create, scheme and trade, the sidewalk tables where they drink and eat and forget, the places where weariness overwhelms and simple pleasures restore. Come now, Emmanuel, God of our neighbourhood, Lord of our lives. This is the God of little Collins and little vistas, of bookshops and trendy boutiques, of coffee grinders and small distractions, the God who is always just there and around every corner. Come now, Emmanuel, God of our neighbourhood, Lord of our lives. It is with you that we meet today, the one who chooses to be near, right here, right now. Amen. Now see, I told you that doesn't make sense for Christchurch. Yeah? But what it does is it illustrates something about the things that we can do even together as communities of faith that take our context seriously, in the context of our response to God when we gather on a Sunday. But even more importantly, finding ways to do that very same thing as neighbourhood celebrants, as the one who speak the reality of what is and what is good about the places in which we live. Thirdly, there is the practice of nurturing. Nurturing our neighbourhoods as good places. Because as much as we might name our neighbourhoods as God territory, we might find ways of celebrating all that is wonderful and beautiful about where we live, we also acknowledge that our neighbourhoods are broken places. They are home to some of the brokenness of our lives and the lives of others. Now, for some of us, that brokenness is obvious. If I step out of my door in my neighbourhood, there are people sleeping rough all around me. It's obvious. It's clear where the brokenness and struggle is. But there is brokenness and struggle in every neighbourhood. But sometimes that pursuit of privacy keeps it hidden in ways that we do not see. We occasionally may hear it in raised voices. We may see evidences of it in broken bottles or graffiti, but often it's hidden away. How then can we as people deeply invested in the call to hospitality where we live begin to unearth some of that brokenness and struggle and speak to it? What can we do to take small steps in ensuring that our neighbourhoods develop as good places that are about the abundance of life and not just the brokenness of life? What can we do to nurture good places? Well, there are all sorts of things that we can do. All sorts of things that we can do. One of the main things about suburban neighbourhoods in Australia, and I'm sure the same is true here in New Zealand, is that neighbourhoods are often profoundly lonely places. Lonely places where people's pursuit of privacy is alive and well, but in the midst of that pursuit of privacy, they're people who have lost the skills of connection and association. And they are lonely. And when life goes wrong, they are isolated. So what are the things that we can do to build the possibilities for connection? If you were here on Sunday morning, you'll remember that we talked about the fact that we as Christian communities are not responsible for the salvation of the world. We are not responsible for the transformation of lives, but our task is to create places in which that transformation can take place. So what can we do in our residential neighbourhoods? Small steps can we take to provide the possibilities for connection and relationship and association with other neighbours? This is not about developing intimate friendships with our neighbours. Now that may happen, may be a serendipitous outcome of getting to know our neighbours, but not very often. It's not that we want to become each other's best friends and know each other's deepest and most profound secrets and longings. We just want to be relating and connecting and doing those little things that lessen isolation and that provide an opportunity for connection and relationship with people. When my family and I were living in a high-rise building in the CBD a few years back, it was coming up to Christmas. There's about 180 apartments in our block, and my children decided that we should make Christmas cookies for all 180 apartments in our block. I tried to talk them out of this very generous act, suggesting all the reasons why this was not a good idea, because I knew who would have to make those cookies for 180 households. Regardless, my children were very keen, and so I, as a good and gracious and hospitable father, decided that I would go along with the show and we would make cookies. I said, how many cookies do we need to make for each of those 180 apartments? They said at least 6. 180 times, so that's a lot of cookies. So we went shopping, we bought the flour and the chocolate chips and the coconut and all of the things you do to make really nice cookies, and we made them, lots of them. We bought cellophane paper from the $2 store, we wrapped up little 6 cookie bundles, and my children wrote little tags from the family in 501. And stuck them to each of the little bags. Now, the difficulty is in our apartment complex is that you can't get to every floor. There were 18 floors. You can't get to all the floors. You can only swipe your card and get to your floor. And so I said, well, we'll need to go to the manager of the building and ask him to take us to all 18 floors so that we can hang the cookies over the door handles, because you don't want to knock on all of those doors, do you? Good. So the manager, gracious man, took us to all 18 floors and we hung our cookies on the handles of the doors. Now, we've been living in this apartment complex for a little while, and the best I could do in the lift was to get somebody to smile back at me. We moved into the apartment complex with a rather inflated sense of mission, and we were failing miserably because nobody would talk to us, nobody would relate to us. The young Chinese students, many of them living in the building, as soon as they got in the lift would look down at their feet, and we kind of had to think of other strategies. However, as soon as we'd placed our 180 bags of cookies on the doors, the invitations started to flow. Our children were celebrities in the building. The Age newspaper come and took a picture of them. News had got out about the great missional act of these children. I made the cookies. And but suddenly we had invitations to go and drink hot chocolates together at the cafe across the road. We had people inviting us in for cups of tea and Yuletide logs and all sorts of things. Suddenly people would look up from their feet on the lift and say, "You're the cookie family." We were. Do you know something, and I don't mean to make this too grand, but something changed in our building from that day. The opportunities we began to have, the little book groups that we began to organise, the gardening groups that we had out on our balconies, something shifted because these 2 little kids decided that we would make lots and lots of cookies and extend hospitality. We would do something to nurture our neighbourhood as a good place. Now, chocolate cookies, as laborious as they might be, are not rocket science. None of this is rocket science. All of this is incredibly simple and straightforward, and yet there is something about it that is profoundly, profoundly important. And then finally, there is the business of inviting. The picture up on the screen is of a friend of mine, and I think of Belinda's too, Karina. And Karina Kremensky and her husband are living in the inner suburbs of Sydney, and they have started now a little organisation called Neighbourhoods Matter, or Neighbourhood Matters, maybe the S is at the end. But they have inhabited their neighbourhood in Surrey Hills with the intention of being an invitational presence in the neighbourhood. Now, that's not primarily about sharing the 4 spiritual laws with every neighbour who comes along. It's about doing all of the things we've talked about already, but with that profound sense that we are making space for the Spirit to bring transformation into people's lives. The business of inviting people into relationship with God is first and foremost about inviting those people into relationship with us. It's not primarily about evangelism. It is about ensuring that these people experience something of the fullness of life by being in relationship with us and with each other. That invitational sense of hospitality. It is not high-pressured. It is really pretty ordinary stuff. But that business of inviting people into relationship with us, that they might have an opportunity to experience something of the fullness of life that God brings to us through Jesus Christ. Let me finish with one story, and then we'll talk about this, have some questions. When I was writing the book, God Next Door, I went to Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, and I interviewed about 300 different households about their experience of neighbourhood. Households of faith, Christian people, and really just sat down at their dining room tables or their kitchen tables and asked them questions about where they live and to tell me stories about their relationships with their neighbours. It was a wonderful experience. And in the middle of doing this, I was invited to preach at a little church in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Just a little church, probably about maybe 30 people gathered on a Sunday morning, a little old wooden church, pretty dusty, pretty mouldy, but a lovely group of people. I was invited to preach. And I could tell after the service that my sermon was a dud, because I was standing in the hall with a cup of tea in one hand and a lemon slice in the other, and nobody was talking to me. There are only 30 people. Oh, gee, I really did badly today. Until this beautiful couple came up to me and proceeded to tell me that I had just preached the best sermon they had ever heard in their lives, and I liked them immediately. People of good taste. The trouble is they wanted to hold my hand as they told me, which was difficult with my cup of tea and my lemon slice. Regardless, we kind of got around that, and we ended up sitting in one of the dusty old pews in the church hall, and they regaled me with their stories of 50 years in this little Baptist congregation. It was just lovely, just the most delightful couple. And they were asking me about this little book that I was writing, and they decided that I should go and interview them because they had some stories to tell about neighbourhood. So just 2 days later, I pulled up in front of their little California bungalow in the suburb of Northcote. And I arrived at their door and I knocked on their door. Now, what I had assumed to this point was that they had been 50 years in that little church. They must have been in their 80s. And so I figured that they'd been married to each other for those 50 years. It turns out that they'd only been married to each other for 6 years because they'd both lost their spouses. They'd been in the same church for all that time. They'd both lost their spouses in the same year. And in Eddie's word, they decided to shack up together to kind of make a go of it. So Sarah's house was just around the corner, another California bungalow, and she moved all of her furniture, and I mean all of her furniture, into Eddie's house. So that when you walked in the front door, you had to kind of pull in your shoulders because there were wardrobes on top of wardrobes. I thought we would go and sit in the living room, but you couldn't actually get in there because there were too many couches. So we continued up to the back of the house into the kitchen. And I don't know whether you had them in New Zealand, but do you remember those green laminate kitchen tables with the little strip of kind of faux metal and the nails that would pull your jumper? Do you remember those? We sat down at one of those tables, and in the middle of the table there was a teapot with a tea cosy. It's just so nice. And fruitcake. Oh, I like fruitcake. And we sat together at the table, and Eddie and Sarah, for the next 2 hours, told me stories about the street that they live in over the last 6 years of living together. They told me about the Chinese couple who'd moved in about 5 years ago just up the street. They had a daughter who was struggling with English but desperately wanted to get into university. And so Sarah agreed that she would get up at 6 o'clock 5 mornings a week, and she would go walking the neighbourhood with their daughter, and she would speak to her in English. She said, "I'm a very good English teacher." And they then told me about the man across the road, directly across the road, about as old as they were. He'd lost his wife a couple of years earlier, and they would go and pick him up every Wednesday and take him to the local RSL to have chicken parmigianas for lunch. But he developed throat cancer, and they'd had to remove much of his throat and swallowing mechanism. So all he could do was take fluid in through a straw inserted into his neck. However, he still wanted to go to the RSL. He would sip on his beer, and they would eat their chicken parmigianas and have a grand old time every Wednesday, every week. They just told me story after story. In fact, over 2 hours, they told me 21 stories of the 23 houses in their street and the relationships that they had nurtured and developed with their neighbours and the differences that they had made. They didn't do any of this to brag. In fact, they didn't even know what they were telling me. Because I reached over and I took Sarah's hand at the end of these 21 stories, and I said, "Sarah, isn't it extraordinary the ministry that you have had in this community over all of these years?" And she pulled her hand away and she said, "Oh no, I don't think so. Oh, we used to have a ministry in the church. Harry, he used to be, Eddie, he used to be a Sunday school superintendent for 30 years, she said. He did such a good job, and I ran the missionary prayer union on a Wednesday night. We used to have a wonderful ministry at the church, but we don't anymore." And I said, "Eddie, Sarah, you have just spent 2 hours of my time telling me 21 different stories of your relationship with your neighbours. And I want to tell you that God must be so pleased with you, so pleased with you." And they looked at each other and kind of giggled nervously. And Eddie said, "Oh, I don't think God would be too worried about our little neighbourhood." I came away from that encounter with Eddie and Sarah feeling two things. I felt deeply honoured to have met them. Honoured to have met them. Disciples of Jesus in every sense. And another part of me felt so very sad that here is a couple that spent 50 years in a Baptist church who do not have the language to embrace what they do where they live as missionally significant. That's a tragedy. That's my fault, not theirs. See, the things that we're talking about tonight in trying to bring this business of hospitality home are just so very ordinary. But somehow in the ordinariness of it all, there is incredible potential for the kingdom of God if we can only open our eyes and see it, name it, celebrate it, nurture it, and through it to invite others into relationship.